As I have said in previous episodes of the Pride series, queer history is not new. Unfortunately, the misconception that it is still widely spread. To many, queer rights didn't become a discussion in politics until the Stonewall riots. That wasn't the case in 1920s Germany. In the city of Berlin, there was a doctor that advocated for the repeal of the penal code against gay men. He would also open up a research institute dedicated to the study of sexuality and gender identity. His name was Magnus Hirschfeld. Hi, welcome to the Pride series, where I talk about influential queer people in history. Before I start, a quick trigger warning. There will be discussion of eugenics and forced sterilization in this video, Nazis, mentions of suicide, and discussion of systemic and social homophobia. Magnus Hirschfeld was born on May 14th, 1868. In Kolberg, Prussia, which is now modern-day Kolbrzeg, Poland. He at first went to school to study language, but then switched to medicine. He got his degree in 1892. And after that, he decided to travel around. He traveled mostly in America and made money by publishing articles in magazines. He then moved to Magdeburg, Germany, and opened up something called a naturopathy clinic. Naturopathy is basically a type of medicine system that utilizes natural ways of healing, like herbal remedies, acupuncture, etc. It's pretty similar to holistic medicine. This clinic is what inspired him to pursue sexology. You see, during this time period, homosexuality was considered a pathological disease. So if someone was to show quote-unquote signs of homosexual tendencies, they would be sent to doctors for treatment. Something to keep in mind for this particular video is when I say homosexuality in reference to 17th and 18th century society, it's used very differently than how it is used now. During Hirschfeld's life, the term homosexuality was used for pretty much any sort of queer person, not just for people who are attracted to their same sex. So, like, trans people were considered homosexuals even if sexuality-wise they were heterosexuals. Just the fact that they weren't cis would put them under the homosexual category at this time. So just keep that in mind for whenever I say homosexual. But anyways, people who were considered homosexuals were sent to doctors, and guess what Hirschfeld was? A doctor. So he would have many patients coming in to ask him to treat their homosexuality. He would see the anguish and shame these people had, and many of his patients ended up taking their own lives. Seeing the way these people suffered is what motivated him to dedicate his life to the study of sexuality. So he moved to Berlin and started his work. Magnus Hirschfeld himself was gay, so when he was traveling around America, he noticed that the queer communities there were very similar to the one in Berlin. In addition, the World's Columbian Exhibition was held in Chicago while he was in America, and he ended up visiting it. This exhibition celebrated the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus coming to America, so there were obviously a lot of questionable things that happened in here. It did have things like, I think, the first ever Ferris wheel that was made. It had a greenhouse that you could go to see different plants. A lot of it was mostly just dedicated to showing how great white people were at quote-unquote civilizing other races. One particularly awful exhibit they had there were human zoos. People could basically go to these quote-unquote zoos and gawk at colonized people. Hirschfeld went there and used translators to interview the people in the quote-unquote zoos about how their societies perceived homosexuality. With this information, he saw similarities in queer communities across different cultures. He came to the conclusion that since homosexuality is in all cultures, it must be a natural thing people are born with. Not long after he moved to Berlin, he published a pamphlet called Sappho and Socrates. It was one of the first theories that argued homosexuality was biological but not pathological. This pamphlet was read by a lot of people, and it caused many queer people to seek out Hirschfeld about his studies. This attention had him and some of his colleagues create the Scientific Humanitarian Committee and 1897, which lobbied for the recognition of homosexual people, also advocated against paragraph 175 of Germany's Penal Code. Paragraph 175 was an anti-sodomy law that caused a lot of queer people to be arrested and harassed. This committee created a petition to have the German government repeal paragraph 175 and got many important government figures to sign it. One reason they were able to get signatures was because 175 enabled a lot of blackmail. Many people would be put on trial for homosexuality because someone they knew claimed they were. Sometimes people who made these claims simply did so because they were upset a person wasn't doing what they wanted. Even if you were deemed not guilty in the trials, you would still be socially ostracized and looked down upon. So a lot of people wanted to put an end to all the blackmailing and agreed with the Scientific Humanitarian Committee that 175 needed to be repealed. One of the most famous cases of a sodomy trial was the Eulenburg affair. Hirschfeld was directly involved with this case as well. A little bit of background before I talk about the whole affair. So, when this trial happened, Germany was still run by a monarchy of sorts. The title of the German leader at the time was the Kaiser, which is kind of equivalent to an emperor or a king. And the Kaiser at this time was Wilhelm II. Like any monarchy, Wilhelm II had a court of aristocrats that influenced his lawmaking. One of these men being Prince Philip of Eulenburg, who was the Kaiser's best friend. The Eulenburg affair started when a journalist named Maximilian Harden accused Eulenburg of committing homosexual acts with his friends. Eulenburg then sued him for libel, and if you don't know, libel is basically when a person writes negative and untrue information about another person through print or writing, so defamation of a person, but the biggest difference is that it's in writing. From time to time, Hirschfeld would be asked to be an expert witness in court cases pertaining to homosexuality, and the Eulenburg trial was one of these cases. He saw this as an opportunity to push queer activism forward, and as an expert witness argued that Eulenburg was homosexual, but that there was nothing wrong with that, and the fact that he was so high up in the social ladder showed anyone could be homosexual. This argument backfired on Hirschfeld. People were outraged at his statements that being a homosexual could be natural, an assertion that people in the High German court were homosexual. The government threatened to revoke his medical license if he didn't retract his statement. So he did, saying that Eulenburg's friendship were homoerotic but weren't romantic in any way. This controversy didn't stop him, though, and in 1919 he opened up the Institute of Sexual Science. The institute offered medical care for STDs, unwanted pregnancies, and some of the earliest gender-affirming care. Though gender-affirming operations weren't extremely common, it also had information about gender identity and sexuality, and people could go there to understand these identities better if they were questioning their own. It also had an extensive library on the subject of gender and sexuality that was open to the public. One of the more dubious things that the clinic offered was marriage counseling, where a doctor would advise if a couple should or shouldn't have children based on their genetics, which is eugenics. Hirschfeld did a lot of good, but he wasn't this pure heroic figure that a lot of people like to depict him as today. I will get more into that later on in the video. Another thing he was a pioneer in was his studies on gender. In the beginning of his career, he argued that homosexuals were a third gender, separate from males and females, but later on retracted that belief. In his clinic, he would examine people from different cultures, and he theorized people were a mix of masculine, feminine, and androgynous traits. He also believed that gender wasn't a rigid binary, but rather a spectrum. He also coined the term transvestite in his 1910 book called Transvestites. Nowadays, this term is seen mostly as offensive, but after the publication of this book, the trans community at the time used it as a label for a while. In the book, he argued that gender identity and sexuality were two different things, one of the first books to have a theory such as that. His clinic performed some of the first gender-affirming surgeries as well. Many of these milestones he was able to achieve would be completely erased by the Nazis. At the end of the 1920s, Germany's Weimar Republic was in the process of rewriting the penal code and planned to edit paragraph 175. They plan on legalizing gay sex between two consenting adults, with the exception of commercial use of gay sex. A lot of activists who were pushing for the repeal of 175 were upset about this change because this new law would heavily target male sex workers. Hirschfeld actually supported this new law, believing that most male sex workers were actually straight, but were profiting off of gay men. This belief caused him to be kicked out of the Scientific Humanitarian Committee. The proposed change of the code would never go to fruition, though, because soon after the Nazi Party would take over. After Hirschfeld's expellment from the committee, he decided to go on a lecture tour around the globe. There he shared his discoveries and theories of gender and sexuality. In America, he would mostly share his theories of marriage and eugenics, and actually met with a man named Paul Popenoe, who was one of the lead advocates for eugenics. In California, Popenoe was running a project of forced sterilization against mentally ill and mentally disabled people, believing these people shouldn't be having kids because they had bad genes. Hirschfeld stated that he had a lovely time with Popenoe. While on tour, Hitler took complete control over Germany. The first book burning that took place was actually the burning of his property. Nazis raided the Institute of Sexual Science, ransacking the library inside, and burned it. Valuable information and studies on queer people were completely destroyed. The most commonly used pictures of Nazis burning books that are in history textbooks are actually ones of them burning Hirschfeld's work. Hirschfeld was devastated, but promised to start another institute in France. This dream sadly never came to fruition, and he died on his birthday, May 14th, 1935. His work was left to his two heirs and lovers, Karl Gies and Lei Shi-pong. Neither were able to collect what he had left in Germany, because it was still occupied by Nazis and wasn't safe for them to go to. Lei did keep the works Hirschfeld had on him in France, and years after Lei's death, these papers were found, one of them being Hirschfeld's journal. Now, as I said earlier in this video, Magnus Hirschfeld wasn't the saintly man that he's depicted as today. At this time, eugenics was a very common belief to have, and Hirschfeld was one of these advocates. Although he didn't believe in a racial hierarchy like many eugenicists did, he did believe in outbreeding disabilities. His stance on racism was very odd as well. Like I said, his eugenics didn't pertain to race, but during his global tour, he met the writer Langston Hughes, and he considered him a racial specimen, which is really weird. I also kind of feel like eugenics is inherently racist, even if you don't believe your version isn't racist. I still feel like it just is in general, but don't quote me on that. I haven't done like a huge deep dive on eugenics or anything. Now, I'm not bringing this stuff up because I think Hirschfeld should be canceled or something like that. I personally don't even think canceling people truly does anything anyways, but that's besides the point. Most of the sources I saw treated him like a hero figure, and I don't really agree with doing stuff like that, because quite frankly, he was a human like everyone else, and he had some extremely questionable ideas. But does that mean we should completely ignore the good he did do? No. But I also don't think we should completely ignore the ugly sides of him as well. Eugenics is a pretty awful thing that has hurt a lot of people. Along with that, he also did do good. Two things can exist at the same time. The burning of his library upsets me every time I think of it. All that information lost. He also did have some ideas that were ahead of his time when it came to sexuality and gender, and it has inspired a lot of studies that pertain to the two to this day. Nazis tried to completely eradicate the queer population, and also Hirschfeld's work. But that didn't completely snuff us out. We're still here, we've always been here, and will be here for as long as humanity is alive.